Terrific. Thank you very much, Sam. And let me start out by just thanking my co-authors. I'll be talking about what's Chapter 3, Assessing and Communicating Benefits of Green Growth. My two co-authors who couldn't be here, Russell Bishop, also from 3GI, and Pete Harrison. And also the contributing authors, Professor Shukla, Edward Awafo, Celine, who is actually here in the audience, and Jean-Charles, who all gave us lots of inspiration and a ton of good material for the work we're presenting. So I'll go through what the chapter, what we learned sort of in this and what the chapter tries to convey. Essentially, to begin the process of assessing, oh yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, I keep thinking my computer is not exactly connected. Okay, where are we? Great. So to begin the process of assessing and communicating the benefits of green growth, the first thing we tried to tackle was just understanding what do we mean by green growth, and that was an important element. What is it that we want to assess and communicate, essentially? And broadly, we looked at green growth as a broad set of goals and having to come together into a sort of a coherent policy framework. And I'll go through it quickly, but it's an important starting point for anyone who wants to essentially get a grip on it and then help to mainstream it into policymaking. At the highest level, green growth is about really comprehensive development outcomes, comprehensive well-being, including social welfare indicators as well as economic and environmental indicators, and also the comprehensive wealth that in the long term underlies that well-being. But to understand green growth and assess it, it's not just about a broad set of outcomes. It's also about understanding some of the mechanisms. The whole way green growth is framed, it's about the process of development. Green and growth are on purpose put side by side to say that these things are meant to go together and to some extent reinforce each other. So much of understanding green growth is about the mechanisms that allow for green and growth to happen simultaneously. And in the work and what we've seen in the field, there are a number of those that stand out. One is around fundamental elements of productivity and resource productivity. It's through optimizing those things that you can get both greener and better economic outcomes. A key part of the mechanism that needs to be put into the framework of green growth is around the interface with natural systems and ecosystem services. So much of what facilitates a green growth pathway is around ensuring that we're understanding the impacts on the natural system and its feedback into our economic growth. And finally, from the point of view of what we've seen in our framework for green growth, the dynamics of innovation or technology progress are critical. Again, this is about understanding how we make this happen. And as we'll see, and I think it's become clear in recent years, how innovation happens and how we progress newer innovations, cleaner innovations, is critical to making the transition to a greener and continually growing future. So there's the outcomes and there's the mechanisms, but finally, in understanding green growth, it's important to take into account the local context. So what you'll see across case studies is that green growth does not look the same in every country, not at all actually. The top three things that you might want to do in any given country can vary quite a lot from another country, depending on its level of development, depending to some extent on what its sector mix is, how dependent it might be on the agricultural sector, what levels of natural resource endowments it has, et cetera. So all of that created the framework and set the stage essentially for how we thought about assessing and communicating the benefits of green growth. Now, we did it in three fundamental parts. One was the identification and framing, which I'll talk about. Then the analysis. So once you've understood what it is that your green growth pathway might look like, how do you analyze, assess it, and start to take decisions around it? And then finally, how do you communicate the benefits of green growth? So I'll go through those one by one and just distill some of the key lessons. Sorry, good. So when it comes to analyzing and framing, there were sort of three major points that came out of our case studies. One is that it's very important to evaluate a range of these outcomes. And as I said in the framing, you're not talking about green growth unless you're really taking a broad view of development. And you're not going to understand the full potential benefits unless you're fairly broad in thinking about what you want to achieve in development and what the impacts of different development pathways are. So it's important to have a broad range of outcomes, and it's important to do so in the context of the existing development goals. So one of the key things you see when you look at quite a lot of countries is often these analyses are done in a bit of a vacuum. If it's to be successful, and if we're to think about the range of benefits, it has to be done in the context of what that country has set for itself as the goals. So in the case of a country like Ethiopia, which is one of our key examples, it doesn't do any good, frankly, to have a mitigation analysis that's sitting outside of government, alongside of government, talking about how do you reduce the carbon footprint of your power sector. You have to understand what the country's development goals are, both about increasing economic output and jobs, about increasing energy supply for what they hope to be is a growing industry base, but also to understanding the food production constraints and some of the climate resilient elements. And it's only when, in the case of Ethiopia, it's only when those development goals were integrated from the beginning into this assessment of benefits that it became relevant to the country, and frankly that it became apparent why this way of moving forward would add value. So it's very important to both think broadly and also embed it in the local context. The second thing is, and this gets back to the mechanisms, it's important to understand very well and to look to maximize the synergies between these things. As we know, if all of this provided very clear and absolute GDP benefits, we wouldn't probably be sitting here. The world would be going down that pathway fairly easily. It's only when you understand the benefits more broadly and the interactions between what we often call market failures or externalities that you start to see why certain decisions make more sense. So it's very important to understand the interrelations between what you might achieve in one aspect, let's say economic growth, and what you might achieve in other aspects of your development goals. And when you start to see those and you start to see the interactions, actually, and we'll talk about this more in a second, the benefits or the broader benefits to economic growth become more apparent. And so, there's a number of examples, but if you take the example of Korea for one, in doing their assessment of a green growth pathway, it was absolutely essential to understand not just what was the cheapest form of energy, let's say, but what was going to impact their energy security, because for them, dependence on energy imports is quite an important aspect of their economic development. It causes volatility and instability. So what did it mean for energy security? It also wasn't just a matter of what does it mean for our current technologies, but what does it mean for our own industrial base? So what are the opportunities? What are the growth opportunities from creating new industries from these areas? And from their point of view, in their case, they were actually looking to be, one of their goals as a country is to look to be a global leader on some of these things. And actually that was a framework through which they understood the benefits. So that's a second key thing. It's to understand not just one set of benefits, but how they interact and how they reinforce one another. And finally, a quick last point. As we're going to see in a second, and as you'll probably understand if you read the entire publication, there are multiple benefits that one can look at, and it can become rapidly an intractable space of a zillion things that you're trying to look at. And actually thinking broadly, but then narrowing it down into a set of most important priority benefits that cover the space. They think through environmental, they think through social, they think through GDP, and they look at the key interactions, but they're manageable and accessible is very critical. What we've seen in many countries, and it's happened, people who people who've worked here in the UK or from our experience in Ethiopia, it's very easy to do studies that go in many directions looking at very different benefits and to get confused quite quickly. The job of actually bringing it together and thinking through something that policymakers can deal with, that speak in their language with a small set of easily identifiable benefits is critical, both for helping prioritize, but also, as we'll talk later, in terms of communication.
2 minutes, Jason.
Oh, God, are you kidding?
Okay.
Okay,
We're loving it.
this is a great example of poor time management. So let me go a little more quickly. So key lessons on analyzing benefits. I've been through a little bit of this already, but I'll just sort of conclude the points. Once you get to analyzing it, it has to be down to a set of analyzable variables. It's important to be broad and to encompass complexity, but you can't try to do everything. to be frank. And again, I think the cases of Ethiopia and UK are interesting examples. In Ethiopia, there was a clear decision to look at a certain subset of benefits in a very manageable analytic framework. So I won't go into technical detail, but it was very spreadsheet based. Let's say it was manageable with the capabilities they had, but gave them the outcomes that they felt were essential. If you take the case of the UK, a very different, obviously, state of development, I mean, you will find 3 or 4 extremely complex modeling tools that are all used together. Their results are compared. There's a robust process of looking through why different results came out and what that would mean for government policy. Again, the issue here isn't that it has to be one golden rule of complexity. It has to be fit for purpose, and we've actually found that simple tools, in many cases, are just as powerful towards understanding the benefits and motivating action. And the Ethiopia-UK contrast is a very good one. So I added this next slide just to give a sense. Our chapter focuses mostly on how do you assess and communicate the benefits. What's the way to select the right tools? How do you think of the right variables? But we don't talk much about what it means. And I think we're seeing now, and it's important to notice, this year and I think over this year in particular, we're seeing increasing evidence of the kind of benefits you see when you take this broad approach to assessing the potential of green growth. I threw this together. It's slightly provocative, but the idea is to say, well, once you go through this exercise, what kind of stuff can you expect? And along the left-hand side, you see the sort of 3 mechanisms that I mentioned earlier: productivity, natural systems, and ecosystem services, and then innovation. And there's a recent World Bank report just launched, adding up the benefits. There'll be a few more, I think, this year, and it's going to be a year, I think, of very exciting progress in seeing how these methods really lead to an understanding of significant benefits from this approach. And I lay out a few here, where you see some of these synergies taking place. Whether it's energy and energy efficiency, or it's soil use management and efficiency, which are shown to have quite large benefits, both for preserving the resource and increasing growth, or whether over the long term it's a better understanding of the health impacts from environmental damages, or of course in the longer term, the impacts of climate change itself. But the idea here is that, for those who come from maybe a more purely climate change point of view, you'll notice that there's only 3 or 4 boxes that fit into the standard climate change analysis: energy efficiency, climate change impacts. There's quite a lot of boxes that are very relevant to growth more generally and to climate change that you would take into account with a sort of broader framework. And I think it's important, and these synergies are coming out, and I hope in a future iteration we'll be spending more time on it. So my last point, with the little time allotted to me,
next slide,
thank you, is around communication. So the last thing in the chapter that we look at is how then do you communicate these benefits? And it might at first seem odd to, why are we putting analysis next to communication? They seem to be almost at 2 extremes of the pool of capabilities and activities. But actually, from the cases that we've looked at, integrating communication into the way you're framing and then assessing green growth can be very important. Now, of course, we're not talking about sensationalist media type communication. We're talking about sort of robust, long-term engagement with key stakeholders and partners, and communicating results in language that they understand. And what we've found is that in a number of cases, there's significant benefit to of course, tailoring the messages around benefits to what the audiences want, or what's most important to their decision making. And that exactly fits into how do you frame the benefits from the beginning. So if you want to communicate well to people, you need to think about the way they see the benefits. And so having that interaction with communication from the beginning, understanding what's important, integrating it into what you're assessing, and then being able to come back with lessons that speak to specific people. And we've seen lessons recently in terms of measures on transport, where clearly what often isn't first on their list is CO2 emissions. What's usually first on their list is air pollution, it's congestion and transport or commuting times. And actually, if you start to think about and assess those benefits in your framework, and you can come out at the end and you can make statements about how this change to the transport system will affect those key variables, your message is going to be much better received. And the second point is about the credibility and how trusted the messengers might be. And here again, it's important to engage in the process all the way back to the framing and assessing to get the best the best communication out there, it's important to have the people who are going to be delivering that message involved from the very beginning. It's important to consult them. It's important to not make it an analysis that feels like a closed club of a particular set of green-oriented people, but one in which is open to people with a broader sense of development and its benefits. So that concludes my key points.
Thank you very much, Jason. Well, that's great. Huge amount of meat just in that one chapter, I think you can see. So we're going to skip now to Will Blythe, who's Associate Fellow at Chatham House with a background from IEA. You were the lead author on the prioritisation of options and pathways, Will. So over to you for a few minutes. We're getting lots of questions coming in from people online, so we're going to make sure we have time to address those questions.